Unfortunately, we aren't going to get to the main course of Rule 6, Abandon Ideology, from Jordan Burnt Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. He's too busy loading us up with the Jungian salad and the Nietzschean breadsticks that we aren't even going to have room for the religion ravioli when it comes. So the tweet where he separates religion from ideology isn't going to be all that relevant just yet. That said, there is sort of a implicit dusting of it throughout, so let me refresh your memory. The difference between religion and ideology, in his view, is who is being asked to do something difficult. Religion only asks it of the person, while ideology has other people doing it. Yeah, I know this distinction doesn't make much sense, but at least it's straightforward. We take the wins where we can with this man. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers and patrons on all of the assorted platforms, just like you. Thanks! Hello, and welcome back to this cognitive psychologist who is just astounded at the arguments Peterson's willing to make while pretending they have the veneer of science. As mentioned, we are continuing through his Nietzsche-splaining, now with the fun of some Jung thrown into the mix. You can count this as a sort of content advisory. He, and therefore we, spent some time talking about the big-scale horrors of the last century. And since we are currently in the middle of a couple echoes of those playing out, I figured I'd give you an extra little heads up that that's coming. This video is also including the Palestinian Children's Relief fundraiser in the hopes that maybe we can get some real-world good coming from his nonsensical advice. So yeah, the rule title is straightforward even if its contents aren't. Abandon ideology. We spent a good chunk of part 1 trying to square Peterson's interpretation of what Nietzsche wrote with what he actually wrote. The short of it being that Nietzsche wrote a parable of a madman proclaiming the death of God as a consequence of science diminishing the importance of the church. The resulting void was the troubling part for Nietzsche. Would people fall into nihilism, as seemed to be happening in Russia? Would the government try to develop its own replacement? Or is there perhaps another way through? That other way through is where we pick up today, by the way. Peterson was correct in saying that Nietzsche did not care for socialism, to the point where Nietzsche wrote that a few major tries at it were warranted so people would get it out of their system. Although Nietzsche's distaste for it seems to come from thinking it would domesticate and soften humanity, and that it goes against the natural order of things, but let's not get bogged down in those details. Okay, so I reminded you about the ideology tweet, summarized the previous stuff, now it's time for self-promo. Fourth wall is added, black mugs. So if you've been holding off because white mugs really aren't your thing, now's your chance. 2 sizes. Ooh. While you're there, you can pick up some hoodies, stickers, or also new, long sleeve super soft t-shirts. All sorts of options to keep you cozy and warm while you're out hunting for your own references. Speaking of Fourth Wall, I've set up on their membership platform. So if Patreon isn't really your thing, you have another option and the rewards are equivalent between the two. I've also added YouTube memberships, but the rewards there are pretty constrained to YouTube. Links for everything are in the description. And while you're down there, you can click a like if it's on this side. Is it on this side? I don't know. Okie doke. Final thing to do is a quick refresher of the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with science, which is nice because he's going to argue that souls are real. For better or worse, that isn't where his solitary reference is for this portion, but I'll save that for when we get there. So let us commence with the getting of theirs, picking up in the section where maybe God is just a seepy-eepy waddle guy. So we're starting things off with a pivot away from Peterson's previous argument of socialism bad, Nietzsche agrees, to none other than Nietzsche's Übermensch. Paraphrasing this quote because it's a lot. Nietzsche did seem to believe what he wrote about the reduced importance of belief in a higher power and meaning-infused life, and the consequent dangers of falling into nihilism. But it wasn't all doom in government regimes for old Friedrich. He saw a third option, in text here as the Übermensch, that a person could create their own values, thereby nipping nihilism in the bud. Just when you think you're out of the Nietzsche corner, Peterson pulls you back in. The Übermensch was an idea that appeared in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book Peterson decided not to reference for reasons completely unknowable to us mere mortals not afflicted with his style madness. I went into more detail in part 1 about the important differences between translators, so I'm not going to rehash that all here. I will note that I spent the extra time to hunt down the Kaufman version of Zarathustra, because that seems to be the recommended entry point for Nietzsche in general, but also for this book. The more common version I saw online was, amusingly enough, by Thomas Common, who Kaufman described as misrepresenting the mood of the original German. Part of that mood is the extensive wordplay that can be hard to make work in English. This is definitely the case when trying to translate Übermensch. Peterson isn't wrong to include, quote, the higher person or Superman in the explanatory parenthetical. Those aren't incorrect. Kaufman was partial to Overman, as it may capture the overcoming and superior position these people were argued to have following the conceptual death of God. The antithesis of the Overman is the last man. Nietzsche saw this type of person the goal of the modern era. The last man is someone meek who prioritizes comfort and the path of least resistance. No challenge, no hardship, just vibes. The main character of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Big Z himself, does a lot of speaking about what will lead to the birth or creation of the Overman. Couple hundred pages of it to give you an idea. So briefly, the Overman is a goal for humanity to become. The Overman will go beyond man, just as man has gone beyond apes. I'm having trouble figuring out how best to represent the Overman because I want to summarize it in a way similar to Peterson. Quote, an individual strong enough to create his own values, project them onto valueless reality, and then abide by them. But in reading through Zarathustra, it feels like that's leaving a lot of info on the table. Such as a similar argument to what we saw in The Will to Power, that war is good, actually, and is more productive than peace. Or that the Overman is literally a men's club because women are not capable of friendship, as, quote, women are still cats and birds, or at best, cows. The story of an old woman who confronted Zarathustra for speaking about women without actually talking to them, and him responding, quote, about women, one should speak only to men. That the solution to the riddle of women is pregnancy. That women should be for the recreation of men. I joked about this in the previous video, but seriously, incel vibes, right? I think I'm so frustrated with this because I feel like there's some good ideas in there too. Quote, one repays a teacher badly if one always remains nothing but a pupil. Which I take to mean that you can't just be a student your entire life. At some point you have to take the knowledge you've gained and try to help others with it. To find meaning in life in things of this world and life instead of what's promised by the Christian church. That the virtuous, quote, still want to be paid in the afterlife for having done good while living instead of just doing good to do good. All that said, I don't think Nietzsche's concern with the Übermensch or the ground we covered last time with the metaphorical death of God was, quote, over-systematized political theorizing. I think it was more about people being inactive in their lives, political or otherwise. But, given Peterson's body of work, you know he is not going to be happy with this individual, quote, production of their own cosmology of values. I could just summarize this next part as he deploys Freud and Jung to negate the Übermensch idea. But I won't. For one, the algorithm has gifted us some lobster eyeballs as of late, and I would hate to be accused, again, of taking Dr. P out of context or putting words in his mouth. Second, I would hate for my dear viewers not to experience the full absurdity of his argument.
However, the psychoanalysts Freud and Jung put paid to that notion, demonstrating that we are not sufficiently in possession of ourselves to create values by conscious choice. Furthermore, there is little evidence that any of us have the genius to create ourselves ex nihilo, from nothing, particularly given the extreme limitations of our experience, the biases of our perceptions, and the short spans of our lives.
Other than pointing us vaguely in the direction of Freud and Jung, we have zero context for where Peterson's pulling this argument from. I've already suffered psychic damage from cracking open Nietzsche, digging through Jung to see where this argument possibly, maybe originated from, could very well suck away what's left of my will to live. I will, however, remind you to take arguments originating from the depth psychologists, especially the OGs of the bunch, with a heart-stopping grain of salt. I'm going to guess that maybe Peterson's alluding to the import the two put on the influence the unconscious mind had on our conscious behavior when talking about this, quote, sufficient possession of ourselves. Could be Freud's id or Jung's collective unconscious. In either case, no. Their purported demonstration leaves much to be desired. He can also fuck right off with this genius creating ourselves from nothing bit. In the absence of a sky daddy or its attendant belief system, we aren't having to invent our morals. Assuming a person isn't raised in a Skinner box by wolves, they're going to be exposed to their caregiver's values. While they grow up and experience more of the world, they can prune away the ones that don't work for them while keeping the ones that do. And they can absolutely create their own values if they find the existing ones lacking. Peterson's continual dismissal of this really hammers home how laughable his claim is, that his advice is walking the balance between order and chaos. Thou must use the values of your ancestors, for ye be wrestling with chaos dragons, if thou'st think thou can do it on thine own.
We have a nature, or too often it has us, and only a fool would now dare to claim that we have sufficient mastery of ourselves to create, rather than discover, what we value. We have the capacity for spontaneous revelatory experience, artistic, inventive, and religious. We discover new things about ourselves constantly, to our delight and also to our dismay, as we are so often overcome by our emotions and motivations. We contend with our nature. We negotiate with it. But it is not at all obvious that the individual will ever be capable of bringing the new values that Nietzsche so fervently longed for into being.
This whole quote is just, we're gonna work through it in order because it's just so much. The Petersonian two-box problem strikes again, this time with the possibilities for the source of values being digging up our values, likely from the unconscious depths, or creating them, presumably with zero cultural or historical influence. Although this discovery could also mean something like having to think through your values as a sort of self-reflection exercise. In either case, though, it doesn't have to mean that the values you discover are set in stone. We're going to use a silly example because, let's say you were raised in a family that seriously valued keeping your shoes on indoors. Maybe it's because there were centipedes. Maybe goat heads were a serious foot threat. Maybe everybody was just sloppy with their Legos. All you knew growing up was to keep your feet protected. But then as an adult, you encounter people who are the exact opposite. Shoes are not to be worn inside the home, and you get some very disapproving looks from the homeowner when you have the audacity to dare to wear your shoes past the entryway, even though realistically in the entryway there was nowhere for you to take your shoes off, so your friend's mom was setting you up for failure. Don't be ridiculous, this is a made-up example. No lived experiences here. Silly. Experiencing a different way of doing things gives you an opportunity to reflect on your way of doing things and lets you figure out exactly where your shoe values are. Now, the case could be made that the shoe values were discovered in this example, but we can easily imagine a situation where they'd have to be created. People with sensory sensitivities such that they don't like the feel of things on their feet, if raised in a shoe-at-all-costs culture, would have to create the value of not wearing shoes by necessity. This doesn't make them a genius for doing so, and it doesn't make their created shoe value wrong. I imagine Peterson would argue that these people just need to accept the discomfort from wearing shoes because their ancestors worked out a long time ago that wearing shoes was the best way of doing things. Speaking of, this argument is reminiscent of the "you're too complex to understand yourself" argument from the original's Rule 4. Your beliefs or values or whatever is something baked into you in a monumentally complex fashion, and you can only hope to find them out through discovery or observation. Peterson writes something completely new in the inevitable follow-up book challenge. Although, maybe this content recycling hints at why he finds it so impossible for people to create values. How does spontaneous revelatory experience indicate we are unable to stray from the values we were raised with? Or, that we are married to the values we discover within us? It seems like a non sequitur to me. This claim that we're constantly discovering things about ourselves reminded me of the joke about the attention span of sheep, I think from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Like, I'm just imagining Peterson sitting there all day, delighted or dismayed by the new discoveries about himself streaming in, because this is absolutely not something I can relate to. The question I'm left with here is why discovery of values would be better than the alternatives. Since I've been in lobster-infested waters for several years now, this seems to be attempting to Trojan horse Jung's collective unconscious in here. If that is the case, no. Bad psychologist. But it's also possible to read this without that underlying meaning, which would make the statement more palatable. And that puts us, once again, at the problem of his advice being superficially okay, as long as you don't dig into it at all. I will agree with the, but we have Dr. P at home, that our nature can get the better of us. I don't want to be a crier. At weddings, during Christmas commercials, other times that don't really warrant it, but apparently I signed over my hardened tear ducts when I got married. But how does that mean we have to use the traditional values of our forebears, specifically the Christian ones? Because don't forget, in his little framework, religion is the other box to ideology. Finally, this last part makes it more clear that it seems like he's saying people would need to invent completely novel values. And while I'm unclear if that was necessarily part of Nietzsche's Übermenschung, I want to say that wasn't totally the implication. Oh, but Peterson's not done trashing Nietzsche's argument just yet. The gist of his other problems with Nietzsche build off us having to invent seemingly novel values, that a society of Übermenschen would inevitably be in conflict. Because obviously they would have to duke it out and sort out the value hierarchy. Right? Of course. How could I be so blind? There's no way people could find agreement on core values like nonviolence or the right to self-determination without some sky daddy telling us to do so. Obviously. I can't say for surezies, but this society of Übermenschen seems to smack more of the Yahtzee usage of the term than Nietzsche's. As if sarcastically responding to my general gripe and mockery of his seeming difficulty in using numbered lists beyond the first item, he gave the previous problem with the society of Übermensch, and then closes out this 2-item list.
Finally, it is by no means obvious that any such supermen have ever come into existence. Instead, over the last century and a half, with the modern crisis of meaning and the rise of totalitarian states such as Nazi Germany, the USSR, and Communist China, we appear to have found ourselves in exactly the nihilistic or ideologically possessed state that Nietzsche and Dostoevsky feared, accompanied by precisely the catastrophic sociological and psychological consequences they foretold.
Of course it's doom and gloom here in the post-Nietzsche world. To the extent that Mr. Beast is selling oatmeal raisin cookies. Of doom. I'm kind of curious what Pearson's threshold is for considering somebody an Übermensch. Why not somebody like Mr. Rogers? Is it because it's literally impossible for somebody raised normally to invent all their values? Did we just find a little straw man in Peterson's argument? This, quote, crisis of meaning idea is far older than Peterson's use of it. The roots are there in Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's work for sure, but the more direct source would be Viktor Frankl's therapeutic approach. But Frankl is a whole other rabbit hole I have zero interest in going down, and I only really brought it up because 1, it is an attention-grabbing phrase that 2, has no attached reference, so just wanted to offload credit to where it's due. Peterson is continuing with the ideological possession idea we encountered in part 1. The other box to nihilism he broadly attributed to Nietzsche, despite it not being something I or my Discord's philosophy friends could actually find in Nietzsche's work. And since Peterson didn't bother to provide a reference for this, I continue to proclaim it sus. Although, if the current mediascape has taught us anything, so just run with an untruth long enough and people will treat it as true. So, yeah. Let's remind ourselves what these, quote, catastrophic sociological and psychological consequences would be. That, quote, everything would soon fall apart in a manner catastrophic both psychologically and socially. Not the super specific everything falling apart. Maybe some potential brutality? Still, not clarifying much. So the only other consequence I can see were the lives lost in the USSR or China. not really nailing things down much. Although, if we're following horror movie conventions, the unknown bump in the night is more scary than the clumsy animatronic or CGI puppet, so Peterson's vague writing may be doing wonders to boost the dread felt by his readers. Pivot to how baked into reality value is. Prior to this, it seemed pretty clear that he was using it in the colloquial, sort of interchangeable with a personal ethic way. After this, it's also going to seem like he's using it to talk about the value we assign to objects or people. Kind of starting now.
It is also by no means self-evident that value, subjective though it appears to be, is not an integral part of reality, despite the undeniable utility of the scientific method.
There's a lot of words about the central scientific axiom still kicking around from the Enlightenment, that reality is the exclusive domain of the objective, which is, paraphrasing, bad news bears for religion, because religious experiences are subjective, therefore, outside the realm of reality and science. Of course, there's more to this thread, but we're pausing for a sec. Jorby Borp's main argument here seems to be that value is an integral part of reality. I've checked with a couple people that I'm reading it correctly, because it also looks like it could be read as him saying the opposite, but with what's coming, the value baked into reality reading seems to be correct. However, all of that's basically an aside right now. He likes to trot out cognitive psychology when it's convenient for him, but he doesn't do it here, so I will. My specialization, along with its neighboring branches in neuro and perception, really are all about trying to quantify subjective experiences, to crack open the black box the behaviorists didn't want to breach. Science can absolutely be done on the subjective parts of our lives. We just have to be careful with the context. What this means for psychology is we have to keep in mind the nature of our participants. So in cognitive, this means they are usually college students in the first couple years there. So this means they're young and, depending on the school, frequently white. So we can talk about value. The perceived value of truth in social media to college students. The values college students prioritize in simulated settings. Even how values of, you guessed it, college students have changed over time. Well, why stop at value? We can study all sorts of subjective things, like religious experiences. I've got a video doing exactly that. It's not going to yield results as straightforward as reaction time differences, but that doesn't mean we can't scientifically study it. However, we slide more into armchair science when we get back to a central argument. I say that because value isn't something like mass or intensity of a physical property. As an example, the intensity of light we can measure with something like a photometer, but the perceived brightness of that light we can only get from asking participants. Well, yeah, our units of measurement can be arbitrary at our scale. Objects are still going to have mass, and light is going to still have its intensity, whether or not there's somebody there to perceive it. Value, though. Contrary to what Peterson's going to argue, I'd say that there aren't values without actors. As such, value isn't an integral part of reality. And I just noticed that my hand's doing the fun, hypercolor Raynaud's bounce back thing. Oh no, they were too cold. Now they're too warm and fire red. Don't be alarmed, it's okay-ish. Apologies in advance for the forthcoming word salad.
But there is something complicating the situation that seems to lie between the subjective and the objective. What if there are experiences that typically manifest themselves to one person at a time, as seems to be the case with much of Revelation, but appear to form a meaningful pattern when considered collectively?
What? He's bought himself a little wiggle room here, as earlier he listed the three forms of, quote, spontaneous revelatory experience, with artistic or inventive revelation joining the biblical sense. So he's probably not talking about only the biblical version, but you never know, especially with the meaningful pattern bit. Because we are really good at seeing patterns in things. So good, in fact, that we'll see patterns that aren't really there, which seems highly relevant to the point he's driving at. Not that it'll stop him from building off that like it's done and dusted, instead of the emergency brake pulling thought it is.
That indicates something is occurring that is not merely subjective, even though it cannot be easily pinned down with the existing methods of science. It could be, instead, that the value of something is sufficiently idiosyncratic, sufficiently dependent on the particularities of time, place, and the individual experiencing that thing, that it cannot be fixed and replicated in the manner required for it to exist as a scientific object.
What? How are solitary revelatory experience that somehow form a collective pattern any indication that they aren't entirely subjective experiences? The difficulty here is that we are deep into vague territory, so it's hard to know with any certainty what exactly he's talking about here, besides value, which he'll come back to in the next quote. So what is he talking about here? What even are solitary revelatory experiences that seem to form a collective pattern? Come on, Peterson, give us some examples. Otherwise it's like trying to argue with Jell-O. Although, this does remind me of the little bit I know about chaos theory by way of my undergrad ecology class. That if we could have access to all the relevant variables, their starting conditions, and knew how they'd interact over time, it would theoretically be possible to predict the end state of a complex, seemingly chaotic system. That his apparent idiosyncrasy could potentially be understood if we knew the, quote, particularities of time, place, and the individual experiencing that thing. The hang-up is that human behavior is a lot more noisy than something like predator-prey population dynamics, so we'd need to know a lot of variables. Just because he can't conceptualize it as a scientific object doesn't mean it isn't possibly one, which he touches on, in his way.
This does not mean, however, that value is not real. It means only that it is so complex that it cannot yet and may never fit itself within the scientific worldview. The world is a very strange place, and there are times when the metaphorical or narrative description characteristics of culture and the material representations so integral in science appear to touch when everything comes together, when life and art reflect each other equally.
Please refer back to everything I said about subjective and objective properties of objects. From that, I don't see how value could be considered real in the sense he's trying to use here. But as demonstrated by my quick examples, value is real and already scientifically studied in the sense that it's basically a construct. And as a construct, I doubt that we're ever going to be able to develop a tool that will be able to directly measure value in the way he's talking about it. That value is an integral part of reality and therefore something we could measure if only we were more advanced. The world is plenty strange, but not to the extent where we can manifest a cognitive assessment into being something tangible. Also, how is an abstract concept, quote, so complex it may never fit in science? Seriously? We can figure out quantum mechanics. That is complicated as fuck. We can, and have, figured out how to scientifically study value. I could absolutely do without all of this poetic fluff. It's only making things less clear. If he instead spent that time giving us examples, he would be more easily understood. That said, he does provide a concrete example of the metaphorical touching the material. Sort of? In his way.
The psyche, the soul, that produces or is the recipient of such experiences appears incontrovertibly real, the proof lying not least in our actions.
Yep, you heard it here, folks. Souls are incontrovertibly real. I know this is probably an instance of his Rorschach writing, that by lumping the psyche and the soul together, he can say to the a-religious he was just being poetic, while still reinforcing those who believe that we have souls. If anything, he's bolstering them, really. Engelbert, come quick. You'll never believe it. This clinical psychologist wrote that souls are real. What a brave, maverick, cowboy academic. Out of curiosity, I checked through my textbooks to see if they touched on the term psyche, because dictionary.com confidently asserts it's a psychological concept. And wouldn't you know it, it's the strangest thing. Not a single one of these has psyche in either the index or the definitions. Understandably, it's not in the cognitive or perception texts, even as a footnote. It doesn't show up in the history of psych text. It's not even in my intro psych textbook. It's like these guys specifically avoided using it. Where's that leave this? If we're feeling charitable, he He's using the layperson understanding of what's meant by psyche to convey that he's talking about the center of thought. But even with that charity, he clarifies or interchanges or whatever's psyche with the soul immediately after. The soul isn't an experimental psychology concept, even in the most broadest of speakings. And all this is for him to say it's real because of how we act. This is an echo of something he said in 12 Rules, that no one is actually an atheist because how you act is influenced by so many factors, which makes you a believer in God or something. We all know he's not a details-oriented person. I shouldn't be surprised that someone who can gleefully go whole hog on Jung would argue that souls are real, but I still somehow continue to be.
It is by no means unreasonable to suggest that
Individual existence and conscious experience
has a deep underlying biological and physical structure. Those with the psychoanalytic bent certainly assume so, as do many who study biological psychology, particularly if they focus on motivation and emotion.
Reference 5 is Peterson's go-to for motivation and emotion, usually in the brain. I appreciate its inclusion, even though it's a book from 1998 and the field has largely moved past what it was talking about. The book seems to have been a counter to the argument that emotion is something ephemeral and so can't be studied scientifically. And at this point, you'd only really encounter that sort of logic at the very fringes of the field. Maybe this is just a materialist talking, but I think it entirely non-controversial to say that conscious experience is a neural thing. Granted, this may be novel to some of his lay readership, but this still strikes me as such a weird rhetorical posture to assume. Plus, there's this weird doubling up. Biological structures are, by the nature of how reality works, physical. Including both seems like a cheap way to heighten the impact. This whole thing is weird. It seems like he's talking from a materialist perspective, but we already know from the previous quote that he's ultimately setting up a dualist argument.
That structure, accepted as a given by scientists and by the general population in equal measure, appears to manifest religious experience as part of its basic function. And that religious function has enough commonality across people to make us at least understand what religious experience means, particularly if we have had a taste of it at some point in life.
Okay, so still seeming to be a materialist position, although the details are starting to get smeared. I'd counter that more scientists accept that religious experience originates as a neural phenomenon than the general population, but we're both admittedly speculating. But then there's this claim that the brain, assuming that's what he's actually talking about with his imprecise speech, manifests religious experience as a basic function. Pardon the jargon here. Fucking what? Things I would say could be called basic functions of the brain. Regulating states of consciousness, integrating sensory information from the outside world, programming actions to interact with the environment. Let's even call emotion a basic function. Why would manifesting religious experience be a basic function? There is potentially an interesting discussion here about whether or not religious experiences are a basic part of human experiences, like what survival advantages or costs we might have incurred as a result of them. But this is a discussion to be had with anyone other than Peterson.
I'm Dave Rubin. I am the host.
Okay, maybe not anyone. But all of that discussion lives in a different space to his assertion that manifesting religious experience is part of the structure's basic function. To reping my religious experience survey video, part of the impetus for it was me never having had a religious experience, so it being relatively easy for me to leave the limited religious upbringing I had behind, and being curious how it shook out for other people. I theoretically understand what's meant by a religious experience, but that's different than actually having had one. I bring this up in part because if Peterson were correct that it's a basic function of the brain, then apparently I'm religiously disabled, which is a really weird thing to say. More importantly though, that while he says this is an experience common to people around the world, he's going to skip over the variability, both between cultures as well as within them. My hands got too cold, so meow. The short version of my point is that there is a huge cultural component in forming the experiences people have. Sensing a non-corporeal presence with you could be interpreted as Jesus checking in on you, dead relatives just popping in to say hi, or a warning from some malevolent force that your shit's about to get fucked. Likewise, hearing voices can be part of a religious experience for some people, while in most parts of the West, it's been medicalized and pathologized.
What does that
The brain manifesting religious experience.
imply? It might be that the true meaning of life is available for discovery, if it can be discovered at all, by each individual alone, although in communication with others, past and present. It may well be, therefore, that the true meaning of life is not to be found in what is objective, but in what is subjective, but still universal. The existence of conscience, for example, provides some evidence for that, as does the fact that religious experience can be reliably induced chemically, as well as through practices such as dancing, chanting, fasting, and meditating.
Friendly reminder, dear viewer, that me dropping in a citation needed, or a handful, does not necessarily imply that I doubt the claim he's making. Just that the claim made needs to have something supporting it, that the readers can follow up on themselves. With that out of the way, let's work through stuff in order because, again, there's a lot here. This is written in a way that seems to be assuming that there is a, quote, true meaning of life to be found at all. He's just suggesting a pathway for doing that. From his body of work, we know that meaning in life is critically important to Peterson. But this seems to be going beyond helping people find their meaning to implying that the meaning of life is a fundamental part of reality. Granted, this isn't something he says in text, but it is where his little trail of breadcrumbs leads me. That Freud and Jung ended Nietzsche's idea that people, men, could create their own values. Our values are a part of our innate nature, and something we have to uncover. It doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to follow this to the implication that we're born with our values. That value is real, albeit outside the purview of science, just like religious experiences. And that the soul is, quote, incontrovertibly real. So he set up all these things as being real but not scientifically studyable, and then starts speculating about the meaning of life. It seems to me like we're supposed to follow that pattern and roll with the meaning of life being a part of reality, too. If you've been following the series, then you'll know that I'm going to disagree with that position. I don't believe that there is some predetermined meaning of life that we have to uncover or whatever. Us having the conscious experience that we do may just be a happy accident that conveyed a survival advantage to our ancestors. As such, there isn't an inherent meaning to life. Going back to the absurdist Camus, that just means you have to make or find your own. That is not the end of the world, or Western civilization, or whatever doom cookie Peterson's currently offering. He is might-ing and may well be-ing up a storm. Usually I dig into the couching language when I'm trying to not say an experience is definitive, or when setting up a hypothetical situation. Is this quote a hypothetical? If that's what he's doing, it doesn't seem to match intent, as he'll move on like it isn't hypothetical. He includes that a person could find the meaning of life on their lonesomes, but seemingly reflexively has to muddy the waters by adding that they'd still be, quote, in communication with others. Somehow. Again, this is almost certainly alluding to Jung's collective unconscious, but for some reason, Peterson seems almost allergic to actually referring to it, let alone providing references for it. So you're finding your meaning of life in the subjective universal on your own, but not. How do consciences or chemically induced religious experiences provide evidence that the meaning of life is to be found in the subjective universal? The brain, a tangible thing. Albeit one you shouldn't be tanging on, really, unless it's conference swag. Eyeballs attached. Anyways, let's call this an objective object. It manifests religious experiences. This is still a physical thing happening, even if the religious experiences are subjective, because that's how brain experiences work. I'd love to know what his average readership is actually grokking from this stuff. I have a literally educated guess because of my training background, but what is someone without that experience pulling from this? Because he is, once again, talking around things instead of being specific. But even then, I'm not entirely sure what he's talking about for the meaning of life being found in the universal subjective. Like, it's got to be the most abstracted parts of religious experiences, right? Then that basically means that I'm locked out from finding my meaning in life because I seem to be incapable of having religious experiences, so that's fun. Pulling things back out to the bigger picture, how is the conscience or induced religious experiences proof that the meaning of life is to be found in subjective religious experience, or going further back, proof of souls being real? But he isn't done, dear viewer. There's more. There's always more.
Additionally, the fact that religious ideas are capable of uniting vast numbers of people under a single moral umbrella, although such ideas can divide across sects as well, also indicates something universal calling from within. Why do we so easily assume that nothing about that is real, given its apparent commonality and necessity? Given as well the near certainty that the capacity for valuing is an ancient evolved function, selected for by the very reality we are attempting to define and understand.
Before getting into this, remember that this book was published a couple years ago now. While some of the current hotbeds were more active than others, things hadn't boiled up into the situations they are now. I think the main thrust of what he's trying to do here in this lengthy lead up to the ideologies to be abandoned is to really set up how natural religion is. Because remember his two boxes, ideology and religion, with the difference being where the hard work is. He's giving us a huge hint by dropping morality into this discussion, because that's what this seems to boil down to for him. Like, there's no such thing as an atheist because atheists still have a moral compass that say things like harming or killing others is wrong. And it seems to be something Peterson can't wrap his head around, so he headcanoned this explanation for it. Yeah, I didn't invent my morals in a cultural vacuum. He got me there. But I also didn't strictly take them from my barely Christian upbringing either. If anything, my dad's love of the Star Treks and wars did more for me on that front. And any other number of fictional works, to say nothing of the influences real people have had on my moral development. I don't see this as indicative of, quote, something universal calling from within. The closest I'm willing to come to that is that most extant communicating cultures have similar value sets. It's interesting he's dropped the couching language at this point. While people can be brought together because of religion, the fact of sectarianism should be more than a parenthetical. It seems like that would argue against the universality of things, if a disagreement of where the divine bloodline went, or just any of the instances of Christian sectarian violence, can cause so much pain and suffering in the supposed name of the higher power, the kind of shared higher power. It seems like the divisions shouldn't be swept aside as he's trying to do here. But see how he's building certainty on the hypothetical train earlier? That it's now not only common, but is also necessary. Religious experiences and beliefs are necessary. I hate how easily he can flip between the physical and metaphysical spaces, as if they really are two spaces or superimposed over each other or something. I can absolutely forgive people who haven't thoroughly been through the educational process in psychology to not catch what he's doing here, but it's troubling to me how misled his readers might be on where psychology is as a science. To close out this portion before the inevitable pivot, I want to share this observation. To me, it seems like he's trying to pin the meaning crisis on people leaving religion. That they are turning their backs on a fundamental biological process our brain can helpfully supply us, a subjective experience that could give them access to the true meaning of life. Time for a hard pivot. What were we talking about before all this soul religious experience stuff? Right, communists of unspecified type. He says her proposal was attractive to the just, as well as the envious and cruel. He concedes that it could have worked to redistribute the wealth, but only if, quote, all of the hypothetically oppressed were good people and all of the evil was to be found in their bourgeoisie overlords.
Unfortunately for the communists, a substantial proportion of the oppressed were incapable, unconscientious, unintelligent, licentious, power-mad, violent, resentful, and jealous, while a substantial proportion of the oppressors were educated, able, creative, intelligent, honest, and caring.
Let's get this straight. You can include a decades-old book to argue a side point, but can't provide fucking anything to support that, quote, a substantial proportion of the proletariat were actually bad people. And the guys who get demonized so often in this were actually their kind, beneficent shepherds tending to their dumb, angry flock. Well, while we're here, let's look into this claim. Yes, this is once again serving as the history corner too. This is such a sweeping generalization. Testing the veracity of the claim is going to be like trying to find the aquafina you dumped into an Olympic pool. So let's focus our attention on some details. Which communists? It's popped up in a handful of countries since Marx's time. Even saying, well, it's Peterson, so he's talking about the Russian communists, doesn't entirely nail things down, as the essence of the Soviet communism changed with the leadership. Who exactly are the oppressed or oppressors? We're going to assume he's talking about the USSR for simplicity. Although simplicity might not be the best word here, because if you dig past the party's propaganda, things get murky. We can start with the people who get the short end of the stick regardless of frame, so we're talking about the broad population. The working class folk plus those who otherwise find themselves on the bottom of the social class hierarchy. And I may have accidentally wikied myself into a useful concept for Pearson's argument here. The lumpen proletariat. So this is probably less commonly thrown around when talking about this stuff because it's just bursting with yikes. To use the historian Robert Bussard's description of the lumpen proletariat, they were argued to be a parasitic social group that wouldn't help progress society, a self-interested group that could be used either by the bourgeoisie or proletariat to accomplish their aims, and or a group that exploits society selfishly, as opposed to unselfishly, I guess. This may have been done to divide the lower classes into the more noble proletariat who are working towards society, while also giving them some distance from the more untouchable riffraff of the lumpen proletariat. I may be engaging in some reading of the ink blots of Peterson's writing here, but I feel like his description of the oppressed maps pretty well onto the lumpen proletariat, rather than the proletariat itself. Especially when we dig a little deeper and see who is generally lumpened into this class. Using propagandistic terms, the degenerate social undesirables, such as sex workers, escaped slaves, and others whose income was outside mainstream society, for whatever reason. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Whatever his intended meaning was for the oppressed, the oppressors almost certainly are the bourgeoisie, petit or otherwise, the economic ruling class who pull the strings and exploit the labor of those working for them. So, no shit, Sherlock. Of course people in that group would be educated. They can afford to be. Mandatory schooling for all kids is a relatively recent invention, and one still fraught with classism coming in and fucking things up. These other traits he lists are a bit more smelling of the susness. Let's pick caring for fun. What does he mean by caring?
What do you mean, do?
Did they open their homes and wallets to those in need? Ooh, I know. Maybe they had some late-night spirits visit them, so decide to be less of a dick to their workers with sick kids. Maybe they even had magic tattoos on their whittled tom-toms to shoot bad, mean people with care beams. The sky's the limit when you're imprecise in your speech, Dr. Peterson. It's a real shame no one thought to tell you that before now. We went through this little aside because it's astonishing to me that people can take his writing seriously. But he'd be willing to basically propagandize a bit himself, to argue that the oppressed were actually the bad guys while the oppressors were the noble ones. It occurs to me that not using the more common terms of this space, your proletariats and bourgeoisies, is potentially letting him lay the implicit groundwork for the ideology discussion to come. That those fighting for the modern oppressed are cut from the same cloth as what the Soviets were apparently tripped up by, at least according to Jorperson. And perhaps more importantly, that the oppressors are the good people in this motherfucking two-box system he's compelled to use ad nauseum. Sometimes pedantic pants and hoodie aren't enough and you need a fuzzy blanket. Not using the common labels here may serve an extra purpose. It's entirely possible for him, or statistically more likely his fans, to clap back at me in this video, to say that I'm misrepresenting him. Vague-ass muppet. How anyone could give him money to have his website teach them to be better writers when this is the shit he turns out? Absurd. This thought is going to pay off later this chapter. Possibly, hopefully, in part 3, so I'm just gonna plant those seeds now. The broadness of this claim, in which he's distilling down huge populations from quite possibly around the world and across time in order to make this point, is going to bite him in the ass when we finally get to what his problems are with ideology. Hitting the same points as in 12 Rules, he brings up the dekulakization in the USSR.
It was some vengeful and jealous murderers who were redistributing property, while it was competent and reliable farmers, for the most part, from whom it was violently taken. One unintended consequence of that redistribution of good fortune was the starvation of 6 million Ukrainians in the 1930s, in the middle of some of the most fertile land in the world.
Before really diving in, I want to show you how clear an echo this is of 12 Rules. He doesn't spend as much time describing the horrors of the period in Beyond Order, but when we bring in his description of the oppressed from the previous quote, the starting and ending points are basically the same, and with the same number of references in both. GG, Peterson. GG. To echo myself from when this came up in 12 Rules, this brief explanation of dekulakization doesn't bother with any of the complexities of how and why it happened. I guess a lot of this is going to depend on how you classify the leaders of the Soviet Party. I'm not sure what Peterson would do. I feel like he would flip on what he's doing depending on the argument. Is Lenin part of the oppressors, or is he part of the oppressed? Which is it? It's important. He doesn't explicitly say it, but when combined with the previous quote's setup, the implication seems to be that the oppressed were the ones who seized the kulaks farms. In reality, dekulakization started under Lenin, in an attempt to prevent the previous rulers and capitalism from returning to power, while also trying to collectivize farming. As could be said for many things, the brutality kicked into high gear under Stalin, who ordered the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. This involved the kulaks getting sent into forced labor, exiled to places like Siberia, or were handed to the secret police to be imprisoned or shot. There weren't exactly clear-cut directions handed down from top leadership, so it was at the local leadership's discretion how exactly things were handled. Coupled with that, by the end of dekulakization, kulak sympathizers, people perceived to be political threats, and intellectuals were thrown under the kulak label. With regard to starvation, yes, it was partly due to the skilled farm owners being ousted. But the people taking over the farms, if they dared to be too productive, could run the risk of being labeled a kulak themselves, with all the danger that entailed. So there was a major pressure to not be as productive as they could be. But it wasn't just that. Because of the dekulakization and other liquidations, millions of potential farm workers were no longer there to work the farms. Of course, the ripples from that would have major consequences as a result of choices the oppressors were making. Why stop at simplifying 20th century history with the Soviets?
The other major villains of the 20th century, Germany's National Socialists, were, of course, also powerful and dangerous ideologues.
I wonder if he thinks he's being clever, using the version of their name that includes socialist in it, even though their ideology is anything but, and that word was added as a consequence of trying to garner support from left-leaning workers. Peterson's bringing up this group because of the influence Nietzsche had in their ideology. He says, paraphrased, that they messed up Übermensching and creating their own values because they did it as a group. Furthermore, he says that Nietzsche actually spotted the conditions necessary for their rise to power.
The Nazis were trying to create a post-Christian, post-religious perfect man, the ideal Aryan, and certainly formulated this idea in a manner not in accordance with the dictates of either Judaism or Christianity. This, the perfect Aryan, could be and certainly was conceptualized by the Nazis as a higher man. This does not mean that the Nazi ideal as postulated bore any resemblance to the Nietzschean ideal. Quite the contrary. Nietzsche was a fervent admirer of individuality and would have considered the idea of the higher man as a state creation both absurd and abhorrent.
The Yahtzee relationship with religion was a complicated one in practice. Yeah, top leadership wanted the Christian church out of the picture, but the replacement to it wasn't straightforward or even really agreed upon. As always with Peterson, it's tempting to get lost in the minutiae, like that the Yahtzee weren't just rabidly anti-Semitic. They targeted other religious and ethnic minority groups, like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Romani. And their design for the higher man also went against the dictates of Islam, Buddhism, and many other religions. Okay, I'll allow myself just one more. As we covered in part 1, Nietzsche probably would have been horrified by what the Nazis built off his work. But that isn't to say that they didn't pull inspiration from his writings either. He wrote about the importance of humanity casting off the domesticating shackles of modernity and getting back in touch with our brutal nature. Part of his beef with socialism was it going against the natural order by taking care of the less able, which, come on, mix in overt racism and you're there. The thing I want you to remember for next time, when we actually get to the advice about ideologies, is Peterson's emphasis that the Yahtzee fucked up because they set their aim and values of what a higher man should be as a collective group instead of individually, and did this without a religious foundation, specifically a Jewish or Christian one. I want you to remember that because he's going to try to use these 2 points to argue that feminism, environmentalism, or any of the other progressive isms have the same fatal flaw. Until next time.